On the surface, the idea of cavalry seems simple enough. You got a horse, you got a saddle, you got a guy with a sharp pointy thing, put one on top of the other, preferably in the right order, and you got your basics covered. But if that is so simple, why are there so many different kinds of cavalry? Look at the Napoleonic era. You got your dragoons, your hussars, your uhlans, your cuirassiers. Well, if you're a gamer, that is no-brainer. Every new type of cavalry is like a new unit in a strategic game. Unlocking each one requires some economical, social, or technological achievements. Each one has its specific tactics on the battlefield, and we will examine all of them in today's video. Also, what if I tell you that each new type of cavalry had a decisive influence on the course of history? For example, if it wasn't for reiters, the Reformation would have never happened in Europe the way it did. So cavalry played a role on a grand scale, and we are going to look at that as well. With that promise comes a warning. By the end of this video, you will probably know more about cavalry than you ever intended to. And now, since you've been warned, let's begin by going way back in history. In 334 BC, Alexander the Great invades Persian Empire. In 324 BC, his army returns to Babylon. It takes them 10 years to literally conquer the world. It seems like his forces just marched right through every attempt at resistance without even noticing it. What was his secret? Answers to the question vary from Alexander was a genius to Alexander was an alien. But we want to focus on one special ace that he had up his sleeve: heavy shock cavalry. In classical Greece, the main role belonged to heavy infantry. The Greek phalanx was a true mobile fortress. Soldiers, locked together by iron discipline, formed the wall of shields and spears. Macedonia, on the other hand, had preserved part of its aristocratic culture, which involved riding into battle. Alexander has essentially fused those two principles into one: tight formation, heavy equipment, and the speed and shock of cavalry. The result was his famous elite mounted unit, the Hetairoi. Now, if you ever find yourself amidst a boring historical conference and just want to amuse yourself, try walking into a room full of military historians and start posing questions about the equipment of Hetairoi. Not before long, you will find those respectable PhDs literally clawing at each other's faces. It will be fun. In other words, we don't exactly know how they were equipped. Hetairoi were relatively heavy cavalry. Helmets, some kind of cuirass to protect the torso, and possibly greaves to protect the shins. Their main weapon was a medium-length spear, plus a sword for close combat. And here you might ask, wait, ancient cavalry did not have stirrups, so the Hetairoi could not have delivered a true couch lance charge like a medieval knight, because without stirrups, the rider would simply be thrown out of the saddle. That is true. And this is why historians shrug again. We simply do not know what exact combat techniques the Hetairoi used. But judging by the descriptions, they learned to handle the spear, probably holding it with both hands, and remained a terrifying shock force on the battlefield. In Alexander's army, the Hetairoi had a very specific tactical role: deliver one last crushing blow to the weakest spot in enemy's formation. Oh, and speaking of crushing blows, by not subscribing to this channel, you are delivering one right into my soul. So, if you like this video so far, would you click the subscribe button for me? My name is Alexei Pashkov, by the way. I'm a historian and a brain behind this channel, and you subscribing would be an immense support. So, thank you in advance. Okay, back to our topic. The finest hour of the Hetairoi came at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC. The battlefield was a vast open plain. The army of the Persian king Darius was probably several times larger than Alexander's, and this enormous mass began to stretch out like a ravenous maw trying to swallow Alexander's army from both flanks. Alexander started moving his units to the right, forcing that mouth to open wider and wider, stretching the enemy line. He waited calmly, and as soon as his experienced eye spotted a weak point in the overstretched Persian formation, he sent his devastating Hetairoi straight into it. The hammer had landed. Darius fled the battlefield. Alexander's path to the conquest of the world was open. And this was the first case when a new type of cavalry changed the course of history. giving the West a decisive advantage over the East. But history loves irony, and a few centuries later, heavy cavalry will play the opposite role. You see, the idea of making cavalry heavier reached its peak in the Sasanian Persian Empire, with which the Romans, starting in the 3rd century AD, would fight almost constant wars. The goal of those wars was control over 3 sources of wealth. First, the gold mines in what is now Armenia. Second, the Great Silk Road, a part of which passed through what is now Iran. And third, control over the Arabian coast, along which merchant ships sailed. Had the Romans managed to seize all 3 key points, who knows, perhaps the empire would have survived, but the Romans never really managed to deal with the heavy Sasanian cavalry. Those iron-clad Persian horsemen were called clibanarii, from the Latin word for oven. Under the burning Iranian sun, such a rider really did feel as if he were inside an oven. But the heavy impact of those riders, covered together with their horses in scale armor and armed with long lances, that was something even a Roman legion could not always withstand. It would be logical now to move to medieval knights. But European knighthood is such a unique phenomenon that it deserves a video of its own. By the way, let us know in the comments if we should make one. But for now, we'll skip the golden age of chivalry and jump straight to the moment when it has literally ran into a problem, a long, sharp and pointy problem. You see, in the 15th century, mostly in the Habsburg lands, Austria, Germany, Switzerland, Spain, a new military tactic appeared. Well-trained soldiers formed up in a square, musketeers stood along the edges, pikemen stood in the middle, armed with long pikes which they could brace against the ground when needed. For attacking cavalry, this posed a double threat. As the horsemen approached, the musketeers had time to fire 1 or 2 volleys and then literally hide behind the rows of pikemen. The pikemen in turn lowered their weapons forward. You had to be suicidal to charge full speed into a formation like that. So now, all of a sudden, infantry ruled the battlefield again. Cavalry found itself on the edge of becoming obsolete, and it desperately needed to reinvent itself to stay relevant. Well, it did. Before you is a revolutionary type of cavalryman. The armor may look familiar, and indeed, in terms of protection, it was not far behind classic knightly armor. The most obvious difference is probably the open helmet. This was a risk the reiters, a German for rider, had to accept, because their tactics required a clear eyesight. For instead of lance, the reiters carried 2 pistols. To use them, they developed a tactic known as the caracol. Funny enough, the word comes from the Spanish word for snail, though there was nothing slow about the reiters' actions. Okay, here is a brief instruction on how to act like a reiter. Form up in several ranks and ride toward the enemy. When close enough, discharge your pistol. A good reiter was able to shoot almost at point blank. One tiny mistake and you end up as a kebab on some Swiss mercenary spike. But if everything went well, the horseman, having fired his weapon, made a sharp turn and moved off to the side. Those curving streams of horses resembled the spirals of a snail shell, hence the name of the maneuver. And then the next line fired, then the third, and so on. This rolling wave of fire was supposed to break up the ranks of infantry, while also saving the lives of the riders, who no longer had to throw themselves chest first onto a wall of pikes. Moreover, at the Battle of Hetairoi in 1587, reiters proved effective not only against the new kind of infantry, but also against the old kind of cavalry as well. They closed in on the French knights and discharged their pistols straight into their faces. Then they drew their short swords and moved into close combat. The French suffered a crushing defeat. And here is the kicker. They were fighting against the forces of Henry of Navarre, the future King Henry IV of France, who was leading the Huguenot Protestant army against the French Catholic forces. I mean, you do remember that the 16th century was the age of religious wars in Europe, right? Catholics were fighting Protestants in France, Germany, and the Netherlands. The epicenter of the Reformation was Germany, and as it happened, Germany was also where the reiters were essentially invented. In the end, the reiters became the main shock force of the Protestant armies. Largely thanks to their new tactics, European Protestants defended their right to believe as they saw fit, and this is the third example of how cavalry changed the course of history. But what's irritating about technological progress is that the damn thing never slows down. So, by the end of the 18th century, European armies moved from muskets to more advanced firearms. They shoot faster, further, and more accurately. Even heavily armed reiters can no longer get close. So, all European armies switched to linear tactics. Soldiers form thin lines and deliver aimed volley fire. It would seem that cavalry has no place in this kind of war. But if we learned anything from the original Star Wars trilogy, it is that even the Death Star has a weak spot. In our case, such spot were the flanks. Infantry could be massacred by cavalry if it managed to strike from the side. The second vulnerability was communications. Armies were becoming too large. Behind tens of thousands of infantrymen crawled slow cart trains loaded with food, gunpowder, and bullets. Intercept those, and you leave your enemy's army helpless. And so, new types of cavalry appeared, adapted to those specific tasks. First of all, the hussars. The name itself seems to be of Hungarian origin. Well, why, I'll explain in a second. For now, let's just admire them. When it came to flashy uniforms, nobody came even close to the hussars. They could not attack a properly formed infantry line, nor should they. The task of the hussars was fast raids into the enemy rear, sudden flanking maneuvers, intercepting baggage trains. Their main weapon was the saber, designed for close combat. The second type of light cavalry that developed around the same time was the uhlans. They had two distinctive features: a tall, square-topped leather cap and a colored pennant attached to the tip of the lance, which was their primary weapon. And this tells us a lot about their role on the battlefield. First, the uhlan was an anti-cavalry unit. A detachment of uhlans could drive off a sudden hussar attack, because thanks to the longer reach, uhlan always had the advantage. Besides, they could also be effective against infantry. Of course, throwing a unit of uhlans against an infantry, square firing volley after volley, would be suicide. But if the infantry had already been shaken by canister fire, then the uhlans with their lances could break through. And yes, the uhlans also originally emerged in Poland and Hungary. This was not an accident. On Europe's southern borders, armies constantly had to deal with the light cavalry of the Tatars and the Turks. The art of fast warfare had to be learned, and Hungarians learned it quickly. Later, light cavalry was adopted by the countries of Central Europe, especially by the weaker ones. First, Austria, which by the 18th century had already lost much of its former influence. Then Prussia, which on the contrary was only beginning to rise. In other words, hussars and uhlans became a typical weapon of the weak, relatively cheap, highly specialized, designed specifically to exploit vulnerabilities of stronger enemy armies. In this sense, they resemble drones in modern warfare. How effective was this new solution? Well, let's see. In 1740, the War of the Austrian Succession begins. After the death of the Habsburg ruler, three hungry predators, France, Spain, and Prussia, decided that the moment has come to literally tear Austria apart. During the war, the Austrians actively used their new cavalry units. The result? They did have to give up some territory, but the country itself survived intact. Moreover, during this war, Prussia learns from Austrian experience and creates hussars and uhlan units of its own. They pass a brutal test during the next major conflict, the 7 Years' War, which begins in 1756. Now, Prussia is the one in a desperate situation. It faces a coalition of Russia, France, and Austria. Just look at the size of that coalition on the map and judge Frederick II's chances for yourself. And yet, Russia, battered and exhausted, survives and loses no territory. The facts here speak for themselves. Light cavalry becomes a hack, which allows Austria and Prussia stay on a European map. Who cares, you might ask? Well, I care for once, because I like those Austrian chocolates, you know, with the Mozart on them. But just to make this video complete, here is one odd fact. In the Napoleonic era, heavy cavalry suddenly makes a comeback. Napoleon creates new regiments of cuirassiers, big men on big horses wearing shiny breastplates and helmets. He uses them in almost the same way Alexander the Great used his Hetairoi, as a decisive strike force against weakened enemy lines. Interestingly, around the same time, cuirassiers also appear in the Russian army. And let me tell you, in their gilded cuirasses and helmets with double-headed eagles, they looked cool as hell. Here is a portrait of Grand Duke Paul, son of Russian Emperor Alexander II. Let me put it this way. I am a married man, but for a cuirassier colonel, well, I might make an exception. But all kidding aside, today's video goes far beyond the difference between uhlans and hussars. What we have really learned today is just how complicated the machinery of history is. Technological progress makes new kinds of weapons possible. New weapons create new tactics. New tactics change the balance of power, and that in turn builds some empires and brings others down. Our world is a finely tuned mechanism, and here on this channel we do our best to explain how it really works. If you appreciate our work, please give this video a like and subscribe. And if you are interested in other odd factors influencing history, like, say, philosophy, here is a video about modern Russian thinker Alexander Dugin. The word is, he's got Putin's ear, and it is his ideas that are floating in Putin's head, which has all kinds of consequences. Watch this video right here. Chances are you'll enjoy it.